Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Hello and welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Shazla Chidello.
This week, what will the Khashoggi affair mean for US-Saudi relations?
The partnership with Saudi Arabia, it's based on a common set of interests.
The midterms are less than 3 weeks away. We'll be looking at the latest polls and the major policy issues.
And we'll look at the Trump effect on a key race in the Sunshine State of Florida.
Neither party can win without making inroads into the 28% of Florida's registered voters who are not registered as Democrats or Republicans.
But first, the John Barron effect in the news.
President Trump has denied he is providing cover for the Saudi regime, which is accused by Turkey of killing journalist Jamal Khashoggi 2 weeks ago in Istanbul. President Trump has spoken to the Saudi King Salman and suggested the presumed murder was the work of rogue killers. He's likened the allegations to those made against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh.
Not giving cover at all. With that being said, Saudi Arabia has been a very important ally of ours in the Middle East.
US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has also come under fire for a friendly-looking meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh this week.
Told me they were going to conduct a thorough, complete, transparent investigation.
President Trump has asked Turkey to hand over tapes they claim contain audio and video of Khashoggi's killing. Mike Pompeo has reportedly now heard those tapes, but Turkey is refusing to hand them over. Republicans, including Senator Marco Rubio, are calling for a tougher line with the Saudis, from the president as well as the Congress.
This is going to alter the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia for the foreseeable future. What those specific measures are, obviously, is going to be up for debate, but they'll be strong and they'll be meaningful. Congress will act. We'll see what the administration does. It sounds to me like, in the end of the day, they will also follow suit.
Yeah, I don't know about these rogue killers, John.
Really?
According to the New York Times, at least 9 of the 15 suspects worked for the Saudi security services, military or other government ministries. 3 of them in his personal security team. And one of them is thought to be one of the Crown Prince's bodyguards. So they seem like pretty official rogues to me. The question is, why would Trump be covering for them? Trump very firmly denied any personal motive.
For the record, I have no financial interest in Saudi Arabia.
And it took less than an hour for him to be fact-checked by Fox News. That's gotta hurt. In particular, that 1991 yacht sale was one of 2 times that Trump was saved from bankruptcy by a Saudi prince. The 2001 sale was worth $4.5 million. In 2015, he boasted a few times about literally hundreds of millions of dollars of sales to the Saudis. And as for that Trump hotel, the Saudis don't even stay there. They just book the place out and make lots of money for Trump. But then there are the good old-fashioned reasons why an American president might suck up to Saudi Arabia. Over to the history department.
Relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia have always been complicated, based more on shared needs than shared values. The Saudis first invited American oil companies into the kingdom in the 1930s. By the end of World War II, they'd discovered what was then the world's largest oil reserves. And until the 1970s, things went along fairly smoothly. Saudi Arabia's absolute monarchy providing an anchor of stability in a troubled era of the Cold War, decolonisation and nationalism. But support for Israel in the War of October 1973, when Saudi units were enlisted to help defend Syria from an Israeli counterattack, put them on the opposite side to the United States. And things got worse when OPEC oil producers, including the Saudis, wielded their greatest weapon of all.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories.
As Israeli forces pushed towards Damascus and Cairo, OPEC announced an embargo on oil exports to the United States. With America's reliance on imported crude for heating as well as its gas-guzzling cars, President Nixon warned of a long, cold winter ahead.
to be sure that there is enough oil to go around for the entire winter all over the country. It will be essential for all of us to live and work in lower temperatures.
As the cost of oil doubled, tripled, then quadrupled, prices at US gas pumps went from under 30 cents a gallon to closer to 60. Inflation shot up, the stock market slumped, recession loomed.
Please, don't be foolish.
Secretary of State Henry Kissinger spent the next few months engaged in shuttle diplomacy, trying to broker a peace deal between Israel, Syria and Egypt.
We had a very warm and I think a very useful discussion.
The embargo was lifted in March 1974. A peace deal was signed in Geneva that June, with both sides claiming victory. Meanwhile, in secret, another deal was being put together.
The direction that we're taking.
In July 1974, President Nixon sent US Treasury Secretary William Simon, a former Wall Street bond trader, on a mission to Saudi Arabia with an offer. The US would keep buying its oil from the Saudis and supplying them with military aid and equipment, and in return the Saudis would invest billions of so-called petrodollars into US government treasury bonds, financing American spending and creating the kind of interdependence that would prevent the Saudis damaging the US economically through things like an oil embargo.
Cooperation among nations, the interdependence of nations, is an extremely important point, and this is constantly brought up in all of our conversations on cooperation and development.
The Saudi King Faisal bought it, but insisted the Saudi purchase of in excess of $100 billion worth of US treasuries remain a secret, which it did until 2016. But now, as relations between the Saudis and the US are again under strain over the Khashoggi affair, there are concerns the Americans may have handed over two more powerful weapons to be used against them: debt and arms. The Saudis have already threatened to sell off their bonds in response to votes by the US Congress they didn't like, and clearly President Trump is worried about losing a major weapons deal.
They're spending $110 billion purchasing military equipment and other things. If we don't sell it to them, they'll say, well, thank you very much, we'll buy it from Russia, or thank you very much, we'll buy it from China. That doesn't help us, not when it comes to jobs and not when it comes to our companies losing out on that work.
By the way, on that $110 billion of arms sales that Trump was talking about, there were actually only $5.5 billion of sales last year, with the promise of $14 billion more, which is less than the size of the Boeing contract alone that Trump burnt by tearing up the Iran deal. So there is that.
Good to know it's not all about the money then. Well, for more, we are joined by Danielle Petka, the Vice President of the American Enterprise Institute. She's a leading conservative voice in American foreign policy circles. Danielle Petka, welcome back to the program. Now, what have you made of the Trump administration's response to the Khashoggi affair so far?
Well, the president has really been all over the map. At first, he expressed great concern. Then he expressed some doubt about the role of Saudi Arabia. And just again on Thursday in Washington, he said that there would be very serious consequences if the accusations that the Saudis were involved were true. So the president has had all sorts of positions.
What do you think those consequences should be?
That's really the very difficult question for the United States. The problem for us right now is that the partnership with Saudi Arabia is not a partnership based on a common set of morals or values or governance. It's based on a common set of interests in the region. Saudi Arabia is probably the most important partner in our fight with the extraordinarily dangerous government of Iran. And if we are going to move strongly against the Saudis in a way that would change that relationship, it is going to actually impact the Iran strategy. I think that's what the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and the President are trying to figure out.
Before we move against Saudi Arabia, should we be at all worried that most of our information seems to come directly from the Turkish government, who aren't exactly reliable themselves?
Well, that's actually a terrific question and probably something that hasn't gotten enough focus. The Turkish government and the Erdogan regime there have really sort of positioned themselves in the Middle East as the godfathers of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that has been sanctioned as terrorist by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So absolutely there's an agenda at work. But, you know, just because people are out to get you doesn't mean that you are not guilty. And unfortunately, in addition to the large amounts of intelligence that have been leaked obviously based on bugs the Turks placed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, there has apparently been an ample amount of intelligence in the United States that has at least confirmed the outlines of the story.
If the rogue killer hypothesis and indeed the interrogation gone wrong somehow hypotheses aren't true, and there is evidence that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was giving direct orders for this thing to happen, how should the US respond quite directly and personally when it comes to his future role in Saudi Arabia?
There are a number of options the United States has in terms of U.S. law. We have something called global Magnitsky sanctions that could certainly hit the Saudis' ability to travel out of the country, to use money outside Saudi Arabia. There are a variety of tools that are available to the United States. The problem for us, again, is that if Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, is actually proven to have been directly involved, I'm not quite sure what the plan B is. There is no other chosen leader in Saudi Arabia. He is the Crown Prince. He was chosen by his father, the king. He was actually chosen as other brothers were passed over, and he's consolidated power and gotten rid of a lot of his rivals. So I'm not quite sure when people say MBS must go, who they actually think is going to be in his place.
Danielle, what about the threat of retaliation? We've heard some Saudi Arabian elements threatening that if there are sanctions imposed against them, they might push the price of oil up to $200 a barrel. Could Saudi Arabia realistically wreck the American economy?
I don't think Saudi Arabia can wreck the American economy, but you're absolutely right. Saudi Arabia has been using proxies and through its Saudi-owned or sponsored newspapers and television stations has actually been issuing threats like this. That is foolish in the extreme in the first place. There are actually people here in America who speak Arabic and understand what they're saying. And second of all, no, this is not... Of course, Saudi Arabia has the ability to impact oil prices. Then again, Saudi Arabia also wishes to sell its oil, needs the money from the sale of its oil, and does not wish to make itself into an international pariah. That's why the next day or two is really important. They've got to figure out what their full and transparent investigation looks like. They've got to complete it, and they've got to give answers.
Danielle Petka, what do you make of the kind of blame Trump narrative that has been put forward? The idea that by turning a blind eye to Vladimir Putin's attempted killing of exiles, the death of close to 40 Russian journalists on his watch, by prioritising business over human rights in international affairs, he essentially gave the green light to the Saudis to do this.
Yes, we hear this kind of thing a lot here in Washington. And, you know, I suppose that it is possible that some people genuinely believe that the earth rotates around Donald Trump. But, in fact, I don't think that the Saudis needed any encouragement to have a disregard for human freedom, to arrest political opponents, to kill people with whom they disagree, or, frankly, to conduct a war against Yemen that is being promoted by its arch-rival Iran. Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen began under Barack Obama. We know that Vladimir Putin didn't rise to power when Donald Trump became president. So I think this sort of theory, the Donald Trump theory of everything is, not only does it not hold water, it's not terribly helpful in analysing what the right next steps are.
Talking about the war in Yemen, thousands of people have been killed in Yemen. There are 10 million people on the verge of being starved as a direct result of Saudi Arabian tactics. Yet it seems this single journalist has made so much more difference to Americans' view on the war in Yemen and Saudi Arabia than all those people combined. Why is that?
It's a very shrewd observation. I have been mystified over the last decade why, for example, we can watch 500,000 people die in Syria and no one cares, why you can see a bus blown up in Yemen by the Saudis and not enough people care, and yet this one lone journalist has managed to ignite a conflagration. That doesn't mean that the journalist shouldn't have ignited a conflagration. It just makes us wonder why it is that all of these others have been the objects of so little concern. And I don't have an answer for you. It is absolutely mystifying.
Danielle Petka, we always appreciate your analysis. Thanks for joining us once again.
Cheers. Thank you for having me.
Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts released the results of a DNA test after Republicans questioned her claim that she had Native American family heritage, earning her this presidential nickname.
Pocahontas, Pocahontas. Pocahontas. I mean, Pocahontas, Elizabeth Warren, seriously.
So sceptical was he, the president even made this pledge.
I will give you $1 million to your favorite charity, paid for by Trump, if you take the test and it shows you're an Indian.
Well, Senator Warren says that Native American heritage has always been a part of her family's story. She says her parents were forced to elope in the 1930s because her father's parents didn't approve of her mother having Cherokee blood. So, this week, in a campaign-style video, Senator Warren announced that she had taken a DNA test.
In the senator's genome, we did find 5 segments of Native American ancestry with very high confidence, where we believe the error rate is less than 1 in 1,000.
A low error rate, but potentially also a low Native American rate.
So her Native American ancestry may date back 6 to 10 generations. She's potentially 1/1024th Indian.
And President Trump is refusing to pay that $1 million.
Pocahontas, the bad version, sometimes referred to as Elizabeth Warren, is getting slammed. She took a bogus DNA test and it showed that she may be 1/1024th, far less than the average American. Now, Cherokee Nation denies her, quote, DNA test is useless, close quote, even they don't want her. Phony.
And that is true. The Cherokee Nation does say that DNA doesn't prove membership of any particular tribal group.
DNA at best can give you some indicators of some markers that indicate that you're related to somebody who lived long ago that may have lived in North and South America, may have been a native peoples of those continents.
But lost in all of that was the more important point in Warren's video, the suggestion that she got academic jobs because she claimed Native American heritage. That is false.
Remember her heritage ever coming up during the hiring process?
No. Her heritage had no bearing on her hiring, period.
I was chairing the committee that year. If ethnicity had been part of the discussion, I would have known about it.
Her name with respect to racial minority hires, no, never. It's nonsense.
But with all of the attention on the fraction and not the facts, the president piled on.
Elizabeth Warren is being hammered even by the left. Her false claims of Indian heritage is only selling to very low IQ individuals.
Yeah, as you say, John, the story did become all about the DNA test. Firstly, because the test was offensive to Native Americans, who pointed out that Native American identity is not one of biology, but of culture. They argued she had no Native American culture, so according to them, she shouldn't have ticked the heritage box. And she accepts their point, but still, relying on that DNA test undermines the sincerity of her acknowledgement. Secondly, regardless of her intentions, Harvard did use her claimed heritage to rebut accusations about its lack of diversity. Back in 1996, Harvard claimed, although the conventional wisdom among students and faculty is that the law school faculty includes no minority women, Professor of Law Elizabeth Warren is Native American. And they claimed that more than once. So rather than apologising for the role that she played in that sham, she's implicitly justified it with this DNA test. And lastly, yes, this confirms Warren has a distant ancestor who's Native American, like she said, but being between 0.09% and 1.6% Native American, it just sounds foolish. In fact, when South Park once made a joke about exactly this kind of thing, they used much higher percentages, even in their mockery.
DNA in me showed I was 8% Navajo. Nobody's making fun of me now or my people who are victims.
I don't want to make a big deal about this because it's such a trivial issue for a presidential election campaign, and Trump was still being a jerk. But I think Elizabeth Warren has made this worse. And I think she knows it as well, because the night she released this video, she tweeted 28 times about Trump. So draw your own conclusions from that. By the way, it really doesn't matter, but with Trump's pledge, he said he'd pay her $1 million.
If you take the test and it shows you're an Indian.
If it shows you're an Indian. So unless Warren is suggesting that everyone who has a Native American between 6 and 10 generations back in their family is an Indian, then she doesn't even win that childish contest.
Yeah, the whole thing is 3 kinds of stupid till Sunday. There's no doubt about it. But it is worth noting as well that the Washington Post fact-checker Glenn Kessler has weighed in, awarding 3 Pinocchios to that 1 in 1024 claim. He points out that that is not how DNA works. It is not diluted into smaller and smaller fractions with each generation, and it is therefore wrong to say that she has less Native American blood than the average European American. It is a very frustrating debate which doesn't augur well for 2020, it's fair to say.
Move on.
Now, here's another good story. A defamation case brought against President Trump by adult film actress Stormy Daniels has been dismissed by a federal court judge in Los Angeles, California. Daniels, of course, was suing the president, who she claims to have had an affair with in 2006, over this tweet, which suggested that she had invented a man that she said threatened her in a car park to keep quiet about their affair.
A sketch years later about a non-existent man, a total con job, playing the fake news media for fools, but they know it.
Now, in dismissing the case, Judge James Otero said that the tweet from President Trump constitutes rhetorical hyperbole normally associated with politics and public discourse in the United States, which is sadly true. President Trump celebrated his legal victory with another tweet, calling Stormy Daniels
horse face.
All very edifying stuff, Chaz.
Remember when Trump described himself as the Ernest Hemingway of Twitter?
Yeah.
I don't remember Hemingway's horse face phase.
Yeah, I think that was the old man in the horse face.
Yeah, something like that. Look, this could be a huge loss for Stormy Daniels because now Trump can pursue legal costs if he wants to. And during this case, Trump used 4 different high-priced lawyers. Having said that, this is only one part of Stormy's actions against Trump, so the other part might pay off. And also, don't forget that Daniels has her own crowd-funded legal fund, which is now worth almost $600,000. So she can afford a loss or 2.
Just 18 days now until the midterm elections for the US House of Representatives, a third of the Senate and 2/3 of state houses. And there have been some interesting polls in some of the key races that will determine the Senate majority. In Nevada, Republican incumbent Dean Heller has surged to a 7-point lead over Democrat Jackie Rosen. That in an Emerson poll, that's put him almost 2 points up in the average of polls, and that is a seat that Democrats have been pretty confident about winning. Not so much now. Red State Democrat Joe Donnelly, meanwhile, is now holding a 4-point lead over Republican Mike Braun, with Libertarian Lucy Brenton winning 7%. There is a big margin of error in that Gravis poll, over 5%. And it's a big question as well, what happens to that Libertarian vote on Election Day? So we're going to call that a toss-up still. Democrat Bob Menendez, whose corruption case ended in a mistrial last year, has opened a 7-point lead over Republican Bob Hugin, who has now dredged up some dirt to try and get back in the race.
When will we as a society begin to believe women, to trust women?
What a hypocrite. What about the underage girls who accused you, according to the FBI?
New Jersey's Bob Menendez is being forced to deny allegations of engaging with prostitutes.
Sex with underage prostitutes in the Dominican Republic.
It's right here in this shocking FBI affidavit. Outrageous.
When will we as a society begin to believe women?
Really, Bob? It's time for you to go.
I'm Bob Hugin, and I approve this message.
What a classic attack ad.
Yeah, well, the fact checkers at the Washington Post, they were busy this week. They said that while that claim against Menendez was made anonymously in his trial, it was never tested, much less proven. They have given it 4 Pinocchios. And in Florida, where recovery efforts are now in full swing following last week's devastating Hurricane Michael, Governor Rick Scott has vaulted back into the lead over incumbent Democratic Senator Bill Nelson. That, according to a poll this week from St. Pete. And in a moment, we'll take you to Tampa to have a look at that race and the battle for the Florida governor's mansion. It's an interesting one indeed. But first, Chaz, you've been having a look at some of the House races.
I have been. Now let's look at a typical poll from this week. The Democrats in this poll are up by 53% to 42%. Good for them. But if you look at only the 66 toss-up districts that will determine this election, things are a lot tighter, with Republicans ahead by 1 point. And the Republican edge does not end there. You might recall last week I mentioned that Republicans currently control the state legislatures that draw up the electoral boundaries for Congress. Well, today, 88 House seats are drawn up by independent commission, 107 are in states with split power, only 29 seats are in Democratic-controlled states, and 204 House seats are in entirely Republican-controlled states, which leads to some seriously dodgy electoral boundary drawing or gerrymandering. According to the Brennan Center, in the 26 biggest states, Republicans derive a net benefit of 16 to 17 congressional seats simply from biased boundary drawing, which translated in 2016 to a 7-point advantage in the House. Yes, that means the Democrats need to win the election by around 7 points to win the House. But the Democrats have their own advantage: money. In recent history, more than 90% of candidates who spend the most win. And the Democrats have raised a lot more money through their small donor network. They raised more in the first quarter and in the second quarter. And as for the third quarter, we don't know the Republican results yet, but the Democrats could not boast quickly enough about their results. 60 House Democrats have raised more than $1 million compared to 21 from both parties combined in the 2016 third quarter. 30 Democrats have raised $2 million for the quarter, and 8 have raised more than $3 million, when the highest third quarter raiser in 2016 raised $1.6 million. Overall, the Democrats have raised almost 2/3 of the total money for the House. Now, I doubt that that's going to lead to sweeping victories because the Republicans have plenty of their own cash and money has diminishing returns. But given that there are over 60 competitive districts in this election and the Democrats are super well funded, it does force Republicans to make some choices about which districts to defend. For example, they've abandoned a number of competitive seats already and left those candidates for dead. And that is the advantage of money. But it's one thing to have the money, it's another thing to use it. So why don't we look at the main issues the candidates are talking about?
Big, beautiful world.
Now, earlier this year, it looked like one of the main issues of the midterms was going to be Nancy Pelosi.
A vote for Paul Davis is a vote for Nancy Pelosi.
Pelosi's San Francisco values are wrong for America.
That is the scariest that San Francisco's been since, well...
Whatever happened to predictability?
Okay, and that was all so scary, it convinced more than 50 Democrat candidates to distance themselves from Pelosi's leadership. But then it turned out that not many people really cared about Nancy Pelosi's leadership. 34%. In fact, people preferred Pelosi-aligned candidates to Trump-aligned candidates. So then that all died down a bit. Another issue has been the ugliness of Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation. Earlier this month, 85% of people in competitive districts described the Supreme Court as an extremely or very important issue for the midterms.
I'm Josh Hawley, and I will fight for the Supreme Court. It's the last line of defense for our values. It's worth the battle.
So dreamy. And this issue has particularly resonated with Republicans. So much so that 85% of Republicans are somewhat or very worried that young men will be falsely accused of sexual assault. In fact, while 47% of people say that men have it easier than women, only 19% of Republican men say that, and 38% of Republican men say that women have it easier than men. So you can see how the Kavanaugh issue might appeal to red states. But there are some limitations. Over 40% of people, for instance, don't even know how their senator voted for Kavanaugh. And a poll taken in battleground districts right at the peak of the Kavanaugh circus found women leaning 54% to 40% towards Democrats, with only a 5-point margin for Republicans towards men. So maybe the Kavanaugh issue isn't resonating so much for these people in those swing seats. The biggest issues in this election, though, are clearly the economy and healthcare. First, the economy. Now, we've told you before about the recent low in unemployment and the strong economic growth. Furthermore, 73% of people say that they are doing okay or living comfortably. And the Bloomberg Consumer Confidence Index for independents, well, that's the highest it's been since 2001. Fantastic. The problem is, historically, there's no correlation between a change in unemployment rate and the change in congressional seats. Have a look at this. No pattern at all. In fact, in the same poll that showed 70% of the country approving of the economy, tying the Quinnipiac record, only 38% of people approved of Trump. Now, this might be partly because of Trump's tax cuts. They're very on the nose at the moment. People, in fact, are actually less likely to support candidates who voted for the tax cut instead of more likely. And in the swing seats, there was a 12-point gap between those two numbers, by the way. And that might be why the people making ads about Trump's tax cuts tend to be Democrats.
What happens when the average Joe out there realizes that we got like the entire Republican tax cut? I mean, we got like all of it.
Side table. How much was your tax cut?
It was not a lot, sir.
So mixed results there for the Republicans. But the issue that Democrats have really tried to make happen is healthcare. Over 60% of Democrat ads are about healthcare, in particular about pre-existing conditions. Depending on your definition, between 50 and 130 million non-elderly Americans have pre-existing conditions, and until Obamacare, those people couldn't even get affordable health insurance. Today, 90% of voters, them and them, think it's important for the law to keep guaranteeing that people with pre-existing conditions can still get health insurance. In fact, 74% of Democrats, 64% of independents, 61% of those in battleground districts, and even 49% of Republicans say that protections for pre-existing health conditions are either the single most important factor or a very important factor for their vote. So candidates are doing an awful lot of sharing.
When my daughter Annika was 8 years old, she was afflicted with leukemia.
We learned our oldest has a rare chronic disease.
My wife, Tonette, is a type 1 diabetic. My mother is a survivor of breast cancer. And my brother has a heart disease.
Okay, you get the picture. The problem is that all three of these Republicans expressed support for the 2017 Obamacare repeal bill, which according to the CBO would have seen people with pre-existing conditions ultimately being unable to purchase health insurance at premiums comparable to those under current law, if indeed they could purchase it at all. Furthermore, this guy
I support forcing insurance companies to cover all pre-existing conditions.
is currently very dreamily in court with 20 other attorneys general trying to get Obamacare struck down, with the Trump administration specifically arguing that they should keep most of the law, but the law's pre-existing conditions protections alone should be struck down. Now, to be fair, all these people say that they will pass a new law to protect pre-existing conditions, but this guy hasn't told us any details. And when the House passed a supposed protection this year, their bill did force insurers to cover those with pre-existing illnesses, but it didn't force insurers to cover the actual illnesses themselves, which you would think is kind of the point. So, as always, it's ridiculous attack ads at 10 paces.
Now the threat is Patrick Morrissey's lawsuit to take away health care from people with pre-existing conditions.
Big, beautiful world.
Oh, one more issue that hasn't hit yet, but it might. A Democrat memo leaked to the New York Times, and it said that candidates should spend as little time as possible talking about immigration, because apparently it is very difficult for Democrats to win on that issue in Trump states. Now, that becomes very relevant. Really? Because, a group of more than 1,000 migrants are currently moving north from Honduras, intending to enter America. Look out. There could be as many as 3,000 of these people already That's them there, and they are on their way now. Now, Mexico has said that it intends to stop these people, but what if they don't succeed? Well, then the Republicans will have the perfect campaign issue to talk about in about 2 weeks' time.
Turned out nicely.
To hit the Democrats over the head with. And just in case it wasn't obvious enough already, Trump even tweeted it out.
Great midterm issue for Republicans.
So we will see about that one.
We sure will, Chaz. Now, Democrat hopes of winning the Senate majority at this point are fading fast, with Republicans showing surprising resilience in swing states like Florida. Joining us from Tampa is one of the Sunshine State's most respected political analysts, Dr. Susan McManus from the University of South Florida. Dr. McManus, welcome to you. What are your thoughts on that new poll we were hearing about this week showing that Republican Rick Scott is taking the lead over Democrat Bill Nelson? How worried should Senator Nelson be?
Well, both of them are worried, frankly, because the poll is a statistical tie like it's been for a long time. What is probably troubling Nelson a little bit is all of the exposure, the good exposure that Governor Scott has gotten as a consequence of handling the hurricane. And Nelson has just been able to go up there a couple of times and be seen giving out supplies to, people, victims of the flood. But right now, Rick Scott is getting the bump that you see in being the crisis manager of a big state like this when you have a catastrophe like a hurricane.
These things, obviously, it had a major impact, very powerful storm up there on the Panhandle, but is it likely 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, do you think, to have a lasting impact, or will it be more on that sort of psychological level of, hey, Rick Scott's a guy in command?
Well, he's certainly already made a political ad out of it, so he's hoping that that will last a couple more weeks. But frankly, you have identified something that's always a concern, is that you get a good bump at the beginning of a storm and cleaning up afterwards. And then if things don't progress quick enough, then suddenly the blame lands on your shoulders. So certainly that could happen, because it looks like it's going to take a very long time to get that whole area of the state up and running. It was a total devastation to an area that's a very rural area with a lot of trees, and it's hard to get to. Even some of the roads are hard to traverse to bring in equipment to fix everything.
Does that therefore mean, being a rural area, it is a more conservative area, and there could be problems with people even getting to vote come November?
Absolutely. There's about 11 to 12 counties that they're scrambling to figure out exactly how they are going to conduct the election, because some people have received vote-by-mail ballots that they've asked for. Did they get them in the mail? We don't know. Half people had to leave and go somewhere else. Can they come back, or can they ask for a mail ballot? Those are all unanswered questions that ultimately have to be decided by the governor. But in fairness, there are some very good laws in place of giving the local county supervisor of elections a lot of latitude on how to make things work. But it is a very conservative part of the state, and it's a very high turnout part of the state. So if you're looking at which party that could impact more negatively because people can't vote or can't get to vote, it would be Republicans.
What about the governor's race as it stands now, Susan? A lot of interest in Andrew Gillum, who sort of kind of came from nowhere in the Democratic primary. Looks to be still in front of Ron DeSantis in a race that seems to be generating a bit more grassroots enthusiasm, perhaps, than maybe even the Senate race.
Definitely. It is truly the governor's race that's generating interest in voting. The younger people are more engaged, and by the way, for your viewers, a lot of people don't realize that 52% of Florida's current registered voters are the 3 youngest generations. And of course, our 2 governor's candidates are from the Gen Xers, but almost millennials. They're young. And of course, very diverse. Gillum, of course, an African-American candidate. DeSantis, Anglo, but their background's very different. Gillum has absolutely energized a lot of the younger voters, and his victory, frankly, is going to be a lot dependent upon whether these students turn out in a higher rate in this midterm election than they normally do. But he's hopeful they will.
Could Andrew Gillum have coattails that get Bill Nelson over the line on the Senate race?
The argument here is that Bill Nelson was thrilled when Gillum won the nomination because Nelson is struggling a bit in generating attention among younger and minority voters, which of course Gillum is both of those things. Certainly that bodes well in a way for Nelson, but for the fact that the first race listed on everyone's ballot is the Senate race and not the governor's race. So the first race that people will vote on lists Rick Scott and then Bill Nelson and a couple other candidates.
What about the Trump factor there, Susan? Because in a number of the races that we've looked at so far on the program, it seems that there's a bit of a catch-22. President Trump is the reason why a number of Republicans are struggling, but he may also be their only hope of winning.
That's absolutely the case. And so the two candidates that are having the most difficulty in figuring out how much they want to embrace President Trump are, of course, Governor Scott and Ron DeSantis. Sometimes they say they're really for what he's about, and when he comes to town, they always, though, have to worry about, should I be on the same stage with the president or should I be somewhere else? Because the bottom line is that neither party can win without making inroads into the 28% of Florida's registered voters who are not registered as Democrats or Republicans. So you've got to hold your base, but at the same time, you've got to appeal successfully to at least a big part of this no party affiliation group. And that's why both Governor Scott and Ron DeSantis are trying to dance around strong support from the president, but at the same time understanding that some of the no party affiliation voters don't really like Trump, and they need them too. So it's a really tricky business for those Republicans running for the top of the ticket races here.
Well, so good to have you with us, Susan McManus. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Why send Dr. Steve Ferrara to Congress? In the 5th grade, he wore this for his school picture. Did he get beat up? Of course he did. He didn't care. These days, Steve Ferrara looks like this. He could do this, but no, he does this. Why? Because Steve Ferrara's a badass, and he doesn't care what people think. He holds hands with men. He holds men like babies, whether they like it or not. Not cool enough for you? Where's your bitchin' Camaro, pal?
And that is it for another week, but big news, we've got a live show coming up at Sydney's Giant Dwarf Theatre on Thursday, November the 8th. That is in partnership with the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. There are the details on your screen. Join us for a special panel looking at the midterm election results, what it will mean for the next 2 years, and the 2020 presidential campaign.
But first, go to our Facebook page and watch our extra Under the Radar. I will be telling you about next year's big controversy. See you next time.
Bye-bye.